Welcome back. Since its publication in 1611, the King James Bible has been the best-selling book in the English-speaking world. To mark its 400th anniversary, the author and broadcaster Melvyn Bragg has been delving into the political, linguistic and religious influences the Bible has had throughout the centuries.
In his latest work, The Book of Books, he argues that while many think our modern world is founded on secular ideals, it is actually the King James version of the Bible which has had a greater legacy. And Melvyn is with us now. And why and how do you reach this conclusion, Melvyn?
Well, because people are indifferent to religion, a lot of them in this country, and secularism holds the microphone and atheism holds the megaphone, people discount not only the King James Bible, what's in it mostly, but the influence it had. I argue that we've lost it out of our history. We've airbrushed one of the greatest factors in the history of this country and in America. We've airbrushed it out because of this tide for pure reason and atheism, which is something, but it's not everything. And what we've lost is the notion that central to the way we speak, the language we speak, central to the way our philanthropy has developed, our education has developed, our democracy has developed, the idea of how women can enter society, central to that has come from the Bible. The Bible was the biggest instrument in abolishing slavery in America, and so on and so forth. We've lost all that, and so I'm trying to restore it. I'm trying to say this is the Book of Books, partly because it's 66 books and it was built on other books, but partly to say, look at the influence this had. Stop throwing away the baby with the bathwater, if you like. Stop throwing out all that most of what we have been made of in the last 400 years. So it's a fairly, it's an attempt to say to everybody, look what we've got. Let's not just forget it. It's so important, and I'm trying to bring it back into currency.
And in your book, before you talk about King James I and his push towards getting a Bible, you talk about the early martyrs as well and the huge impact they had in trying to get the Bible translated.
Yes, I mean, you could say that for about 300 years they were trying to get it out of Latin into English. It seems simple, doesn't it? It seems so simple, it's not even worth talking about. But as a result of doing that, these scholars, many were caught, tortured, burnt to death for literally hundreds of years by the kings and the inquisitors of this country, because they did not want the Bible to be in the language of ordinary people. They wanted it to stay in Latin, which most ordinary people didn't know. Actually, many people in the clergy didn't know properly either. So hold the power there. And it took forcing through, and eventually it was forced through, and it was forced through basically by a man called William Tyndale, who I think compares with Shakespeare as one of the two great geniuses of the English language, and they lived in the same century, and they formed the basis of our language, one with idioms, one with words, and they're fantastic. And that's just the beginning of it. From language it flows into democracy, which I try to prove, it flows into education, as I've said, and the position of, and so on.
Some people would look at it and say, oh, well, the things we've had this Book of Books thrust on us since we were children. It's dry and it's dusty and it's old-fashioned, and the language is hard to penetrate, and why is it relevant to us today?
Well, can I answer that as best I can? First of all, the language is completely relevant. Let there be light, fell flat on his face, filthy lucre, let my people go, the apple of his eye, a man after his own heart, signs of the times, ye of little faith, the meek fisherman, under the sun, to rise and shine, land of the living. That's a few of hundreds and hundreds of phrases that you and I and your viewers are using every day of their life. So
sour grapes, I wrote a few, falling flat on his face.
So as fusty and dusty, that's probably been the way it's been taught. Why isn't it being taught that because of the opportunity that the Bible gave for debate, once the Bible was in English, all of us could talk to each other about what God meant. This was an enormous revolution in thought. Once you could say, oh no, God meant that, God meant, this is an amazing thing for ordinary people to say. And so they could say, well, I think this about Parliament. I can challenge God, I can challenge Parliament. And they began, out of that grew the Putney debates in the British Civil Wars and the growth of democracy. Women in the 19th century, for instance, they went into politics through religion. They were philanthropic, whether you got Octavia Hill or the aristocrat Josephine Butler or William Booth's wife. They went in with a Bible, a mop, a bucket and a Bible. They cleared out the slums. They started slum clearance. They went through the Bible, and then they went into politics and social service. It was used again, and most of all slaves. That astonished me. That not only the abolitionists in this country, one of the greatest things we ever did with Wilberforce, they found their justification in the Bible, but fantastic, the people who wanted slavery to continue, they found their justification in the Bible, so you're head on. Then what happened is the African slaves in America founded their language on the King James Bible, and their own religion became liberation theology, which Richard Dawkins is so bad about in his terrible book. They formed a liberation theology. Let my people go out of Babylon. Martin Luther King. It was the Bible which drove the slaves towards liberation and drove it through. And that's a vastly important thing. Now, if we forget that sort of history, then we're just not neglecting our past. We're being silly about our past and trivial. This is a magnificent part of our inheritance, and we've rubbed it out because of a few temporary, I think, and rather sort of extreme objections.
I'll have to have Dawkins on now as the counterpoint. But I think what was interesting as well, I mean, you mentioned its influence in other countries, especially America. And there's a bit in your book which says US soldiers staring down the sights in Iraq and Afghanistan have inscribed on the sights what?
Well, the Bible has been used for war, as we all know. It's been for war and against war. That's a great thing. But in Afghanistan, in Iraq, for a while, and then they rubbed it out. At the end of the sights of the American guns were little letters which would say J12:3. That meant St. John, verse 12. St. John, chapter 12, verse 3. And there'll be a verse there which would talk about you're fighting in the name of the Lord. The Lord is on your side. And it's inscribed on the sites in tiny, tiny writing.
What about other countries where they don't speak English? What have they been reading what Bible have they been reading all these years? And how is it that they've not been influenced? I mean, they've had the influence of democracy and all that sort of thing as well, haven't they?
Well, but democracy, we've a fair claim for democracy started here. We're all very timid about where
with the Greeks.
Democracy started here, in Parliament there.
Modern democracy.
The modern democracy, absolutely. After Athens there's a big gap, but modern, with the law, the legal, extraordinary first thing happening, the legal execution of a king who believed he had divine right, done through law and through the Bible. The Bible was used the entire time to condemn the king. And then the Putney debates after that, just down the river, they were the formations of democracy taken to America, and it was developed and amplified there. So other countries have been doing their thing. I'm interested in the English-speaking world and the King James Bible.
What happened when King James I put out the Bible? Was there a noticeable change in society?
Not immediately. It was a slow starter because it was expensive, and they'd already got quite a few English Bibles because it had been translated to English since Henry VIII turned Protestant in the 1530s. So there are plenty of Bibles around. Nothing as grand as that, and it took a bit of time, but it took about 2 or 3 decades, and then it got going.
If somebody came to you and said, "Look, I'm really interested in this book, but it's very, very big. Where should I start?" Would you suggest to them, recommend that to get it properly, you should start in Genesis and go all the way through to Revelation, or should they start because there's a big difference between the Old and the New Testaments, of course.
Well, I think to tackle the Bible is quite tough. I think one of the books there are some good books about the Bible. I'm not. But if you want to read the Bible, and just to taste the prose, the New Testament, translated basically by Tyndale, when the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Just reading in those are the rhythms of English prose and poetry, which have been there ever since. If you want, I read it in sips. Some of the battles are good.
Read it in sips. Read it in sips is a very good idea.
And read Tyndale's Start of Genesis, because it's absolutely beautiful. Thank you very much.
And read Melvin's book. The Book of Books, The Radical Impact of the King James Bible, 1611 to 2011, is out now.